Today I'm going to be talking about two artists who were born just a year apart with very different backgrounds. Giovanni Bellini was born into a wealthy family. His father, Jacopo Bellini, was the leading artist in Venice at the time, and Giovanni went on to revolutionize Venetian art. In fact, Giorgione and Titian were his apprentices. On the other hand, Andrea Mantegna was born outside Padua to a poor family. His father was a carpenter, and he demonstrated his artistic ability at a young age to the extent that Jacopo Bellini arranged for him to marry his daughter Nicosia, and so Mantegna became the brother-in-law of Giovanni Bellini, and so they worked closely together, but very different people, as we shall see. Giovanni was a restrained person who produced emotional art, and Mantegna was an emotional person who produced restrained art. Now, Bellini, who was a very deeply and emotionally affected Christian, was happy to follow in the style of his father, but he created a style that was uniquely his own. And that style was one that had a direct emotional impact. Now, he did make reference to classical antiquity in his work, as we shall see, but he was never that interested. So it's unconvincing and in many cases meaningless. He was a modest person. He was happy to remain in Venice all of his life. He painted in the churches. He ran the family business, but was happy to allow his elder brother Gentile to become the main artist in the public eye. On the other hand, Mantegna was, as I said, gifted from an early age. He was precocious. He studied archaeology. He took a deep interest in the classical. So his work is always extremely accurate representation of the classical period. It's extremely detailed. You can examine his work with a magnifying glass and still not see the brushstrokes. And despite the apparent lack of emotion in his art, he was an extremely emotional person. One observer at the time said there's not a single person in the vicinity with whom he agrees. He was famous for his ferocious vocabulary, his aggression, and he always insisted on payment being made swiftly, even from the Pope. Federico Gonzaga described him as capricious. I think we would think of him as an angry young man, very sure of himself, followed no one, but you'd never know this from his painting, that his painting is cool, intellectual, careful and controlled. And he travelled all over Europe, all over Italy, I should say. So I'll start with Mantegna. I was intending to show the same number of works of each artist, but in fact I've ended up showing with a few more works by Mantegna, and we'll see why later. This is an early work painted when he was about 22, about the time he married into the Bellini family. A few years later, in 1460, he moved to Mantua and became the court painter of the Gonzaga family that ruled Mantua. And as I said, Bellini spent his entire career in Venice. Let me give you a description of Mantegna's work by John Ruskin. Give 10 minutes to it quietly and examine it with the magnifying glass of considerable power. You cannot see more wonderful work in minute drawing with the point of the brush. The virtue of it being that not only every touch is microscopically minute, but that in this minuteness every touch is considered and every touch is right. It is to be regarded, however, only as a piece of workmanship. It is wholly without sentiment. End quote. Well, that's Ruskin's view. As I've said, I think if Ruskin had known more about the temperament of the man, he might have seen more sentiment in the work. And we can see, knowing what he was like, the sentiment in Mantegna's work, but held in rigorous control. He painted every pebble, every leaf, every piece of minute detail. And also, this was a time when perspective was being discovered and used by artists, and he took a lot of trouble in learning this new technique of perspective, and he used it, as we can see here, to create exciting new viewpoints. Let me show you a pair of paintings so that you can compare the two artists more easily. And I'll show you them individually and then alongside each other. This is the Agony in the Garden. It refers to an event in the life of Jesus between the Last Supper and Jesus's arrest. And according to all four of the Gospels, immediately after the Last Supper, Jesus went to pray. And the place he went to is identified by Matthew and Mark as Gethsemane. And he was accompanied by St. Peter, St. John, and St. James the Greater. And he asked them to stay awake and pray. And you can see here that they failed to stay awake. He, according to the Gospels, moved a stone's throw away from them and prayed 3 times. And each time between praying, he checked on them and found them asleep. And he said that famous saying, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." And an angel came down from heaven to strengthen him. You can see here in the Mantegna's work a group of angels. In the background, Judas is coming, as you can see, with soldiers to arrest him. The dead tree on the right and the vulture at the top symbolize death. And we'll see again a vulture in a painting by Bellini. I'll show you towards the end. Jerusalem is the walled city in the background, which was then under Roman rule. There's an equestrian statue on a column, a theatre-like Colosseum. There's all inspired by the monuments that were surviving in Rome. Incidentally, you might wonder about the rabbits. The rabbit was a symbol of rebirth and resurrection. And it explains the connection between Easter and the resurrection of Christ and the Easter bunny. So it's still something that we refer to today. And the 3 hares or bunnies on the road symbolize the Trinity. Note here Mantegna's hard-edged style with dark contrasts and strong colours compared to this work by Giovanni Bellini. Again, The Agony in the Garden. It's a bit softer, more human. The forms are modelled by light, their edges softened. And this style was to become the basis of what we now call the Venetian style. He was also the first to capture dawn in a painting, and it gives it creates an atmosphere which is unearthly and magical. And we can see him experimenting with foreshortening to provide impact. So there's a high horizon, a deep, wide landscape, and the dawn light is filling the landscape. So if we were to combine them, or show them, I should say, side by side, you can compare the two approaches. There's on the left, the restrained, hard-edged style of Mantegna, and on the right, the softer, more emotional and atmospheric style of Bellini. And I think you can see here although Bellini uses foreshortening and perspective, the perspective in Mantegna's painting is more accurate. And I've got another comparison, side-by-side comparison, the final one, just to compare them in a different, more close-up painting, the presentation of the temple. We don't know the exact date, but it was painted sometime in his youth. The dates range from 1453, the year he married Nicosia, and 1460, when he left for Mantua. It's set within a painted, simulated marble frame, and you can see at the bottom the cushion and the elbow stand out and jut out onto the frame. So the Virgin Mary is holding the Christ child while a bearded priest holds out his hands. In the center, in the shade in the background, is Joseph with a halo. And also in the background are two spectators without halos, and the one on the right has been identified as possibly Mantegna's self-portrait, and the one on the left possibly Nicosia, his wife. This is a slightly later work by Bellini, and probably inspired by Mantegna's work, but a softer style. The dating again is uncertain, although it is believed to be later than Mantegna's work. We also don't know who commissioned either of these works. The main characters are the same. There's the Virgin holding the child, the swaddled child. There's a sort of cushion at the bottom. There's the bearded figure coming to take the child. At the front is Saint Joseph, which according to some scholars is a portrait of Bellini's father, Jacopo. And on the sides, the painter has added two further figures, which tend to make the painting look a bit crowded. But apart from his father, other figures that have been identified include the Bellini's self-portrait and either Mantegna or his brother Gentile on the right, Nicosia, sister of Giovanni and wife of Mantegna, and together with their mother Anna on the left. And here's the comparison again, side by side. It's the last time I'll be showing side by side comparison, but I just wanted to get established this idea of the hard-edged Mantegna with the softer, more emotional Bellini's style. And what I'm going to do is to now go through a number of works in roughly chronological order by Mantegna, and then works by Bellini. This is an altarpiece in Mantegna's mature style, commissioned for a chapel in Mantua. In fact, maybe I'll say a bit more about the commissioning because it's quite an interesting story. When Francesco Gonzaga was away fighting, a Jewish banker called Daniel Darnosa bought a house, and he replaced an image in the house of the Virgin Mary with his own coat of arms. And this incensed the citizens of Mantua, who destroyed his house. They burnt it down. So now, when Francesco Gonzaga returned, he forced Norsa to fund a chapel, and this devotional painting was executed by his court painter Mantegna, and the chapel is in the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria, which had been built over the ruins of Norsa's house. And later, you might wonder why it's in the Louvre. That's because later this was one of the works looted during Napoleon's invasion of Italy. And by 1798, it had been taken back to Paris and was being exhibited in the Louvre, which is where it's remained, and it's never been returned. The Louvre has given the explanation over the last 200 years that its large size makes it difficult to transport. Just quickly, what's going on in the painting? On the left, in the foreground, is the patron, Francesco Gonzaga, paying homage to Mary, who's on the high throne with Jesus on her lap. The child on her left, on the right-hand side, is John the Baptist, holding a sign saying, "Behold the Lamb of God, which takes away the sins of the world." Further to the right and kneeling is John the Baptist's mother, Saint Elizabeth, and she was protector of Isabella d'Este, who was the wife of Francesco Gonzaga. And it's thought that the reason Mantegna was asked to paint Saint Elizabeth rather than Isabella, which would be more normal, is it's sending a message to Norsa, who was made to pay for the work, because Saint Elizabeth is regarded as, or is shown here as a Jewess, indicated by the yellow turban, and it's said, it was thought that she was the first to recognize the holiness, the sanctity of the Virgin Mary. On the left at the back is the Archangel Saint Michael with the sword, and to the right, Saint Longinus with a broken spear, and on the right at the back, Saint Andrew, patron saint of Mantua, with a long stick and with the cross. And on the right, Saint George with a helmet and a long red lance. This is a work by Bellini, and I thought I'd show it at this stage. It's St. Job altarpiece. It's in the Accademia in Venice. It's actually shown in what I feel is quite a small, crowded room, or room full of pieces, which I think in context reduces its power. It's one of the masterpieces of Bellini's mature style. It's painted using oils rather than tempera, because at the time there was a switch being made. Artists were moving from using tempera to using oil paint, which provides much richer colours and tones, and in fact that laid the foundation of the whole Venetian school. The date is uncertain, but it's thought to be the plague year 1487. It's an example of a sacre conversazione, a sacred conversation. The elements of that are a central Mary holding the Christ child surrounded by an informal group of saints in a unified space with a strong sense of perspective, which creates a space in which you feel you're present and therefore part of the space and therefore involved, drawn into it. And in this case, there's three musicians you can see below Mary's throne. On the left, it's St. Francis, John the Baptist, and Job, and on the right, Saints Dominic, Sebastian, and Louis of Toulouse. And the pillars are copies of the real ones in the original altar in the chapel. And the half cupola is a gold mosaic in the old Venetian style seen in St. Mark's, which adds to this feeling that we're part of the same space. We're there with them. Another work by Bellini, altarpiece in San Zaccaria, another example of his mature style. And I've included it at this point because the historian Simon Schaumer regards it as his finest work and the only work he mentions in his discussion of Bellini as the founder of Venetian colour tradition. I should explain, actually, as I've mentioned Venetian colour tradition. During the Renaissance, there were many debates between different mediums and different styles. And these debates were known as paragoni, or comparisons. And one paragoni was the debate about whether sculpture or painting was the higher art. Another one, relevant here, concerns two rival aesthetic approaches to painting. One is concerned with colore or colour, and the other disegno or design or drawing. So it's whether the basis, the fundamental basis of art is drawing or whether it's colour. Now, the Florentine school of art taught drawing as the key central skill, and good draftsmanship was regarded as essential to seeing the world accurately and truthfully. And so apprentices were taught anatomy and perspective and were expected to be able to draw accurately and would copy from pattern books and would start their paintings by first drawing on the canvas and then filling in with colour, a sort of an intellectual or rational approach to painting and linked to other intellectual activities and to studies of the classical. The alternative was taught in Venice, a city, of course, associated with St. Mark's and brilliant mosaics. And the other thing about Venice is, of course, its water leads to humidity in the atmosphere, and that means that fresco painting is impractical in Venice. And so they quickly embraced oil painting because it was much more reliable way to paint in the atmosphere found in Venice, more durable. And of course, it had much richer colours. And because it took longer to dry, tempera tended to dry almost immediately. Oil was much more flexible. It allowed changes and spontaneous composition, which meant artists in Venice could paint directly onto the canvas with very little or no underdrawing. So, artists like Bellini and Titian. So it's more spontaneous, more sensuous, more emotional. Returning to Mantegna, this is a fresco cycle in the Ovatari Chapel in Padua, but it was destroyed by Allied bombing in 1944. Now, two scenes remain or were preserved because they were removed and were stored some years before, and so they weren't damaged by the the bombing, and also we have black and white photographs. And from those two sources, the other works have been reconstructed. Incidentally, Ovatari was a notary who left a lot of money when he died to decorate a family chapel. And his widow commissioned Mantegna, who was then only 17, to decorate the chapel. And of course, Mantegna was recorded as arguing with the other artists who were commissioned alongside him. And in due course, he stopped painting. He refused to continue, and he came back later and finished the work after the other artists had moved on or died. When he finished this work, the widow actually sued him for only painting 8 apostles instead of 12. At the time, a commission could be extremely detailed and would specify, it was a contract that specified exactly what the person paying for it wanted to see in the painting, where people were to be positioned, whether the patrons were shown in the picture or not, what saints were to be shown. But in this case, it went to court, and 2 independent artists were called in, and it was concluded that Mantegna was right not to include 12, but only 8 because of the lack of space. This is a scene set in an open space with the Madonna in the centre, adoring the Christ child, kneeling on a stone step. To her right is Joseph sleeping, leaning on a trunk of a tree, from which behind him a single branch is growing and bearing fruit, usually interpreted as the mystic renewal of nature under the new dispensation. On the right, there are 2 shepherds come to worship. On the far left, there's an ox, a traditional mute witness of the Nativity. And behind, on the right, there's a wide landscape with other shepherds on the hill. It was probably painted when he was in his early 20s. Note the exquisite level of detail. We think it was commissioned by Borso d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara, and the style seems to be influenced by Netherlandish painting, which Mantegna could have studied in the Este's family collection, and possibly influenced directly by Roger van der Weyden, a Netherlandish painter. Note incidentally the faces of the shepherds shown with wrinkles and other realistic details, fits in with the approach and the style of Mantegna, but also, of course, the Northern European tradition. This room is in the Palazzo Ducale in Mantua, in the palace, commissioned by Ludovico Gonzaga, and it's noted for its illusionistic detail. And you can just about see it. I'll show you it more clearly in a moment, but you see at the top the Di Sotto in Su, the scene from below ceiling. It took nearly 10 years to complete the whole room, and it was his most important commission. It shows the Marchese and his consort Barbara of Brandenburg, together with their children and friends, courtiers, animals, engaged in a variety of professional and leisure pursuits. This is the rule I've positioned it so you can see. I've expanded it from the part of the wall you can see still see on the right, and in this more detailed view, you can see it's a court scene showing Ludovico Gonzaga on the left with his wife Barbara Brandenburg. They're seated with their relatives. There's a group of courtiers filling the rest of the wall. The Marchese is shown in conversation with his secretary, turning around to talk to him, and his dog Rubino is resting under his chair. She, Barbara van Brandenburg, is surrounded by her sons and daughters, and there's a nurse and a female dwarf. The girls are Paola and Barbara. On the right, in the arcade, which is closed off by a curtain drawn aside, there's a number of noblemen, and this procession of courtiers, identified by their leggings, that you can tell from the colour of their leggings that they are adherents of Gonzaga, and they're led by a young blonde man. You can see positioned against the pillar, and he's the flanked by associates, and we think that he is Rudolfo Gonzaga. On the other wall, on the north wall, is a meeting scene showing Ludovico. This is an extreme close-up of, let me point to it because it's a bit hard to see in the painting, but it's this bit of the hill here is this part up here, and it's these two people here in the background are Frederick III of Habsburg and Christian I of Denmark, which is interesting because this is a scene where Ludovico here in official robes is meeting them, although historically it can't represent a particular historic event because there's no evidence that the Frederick III, the Holy Roman Emperor, ever visited Mantua. And the other person I showed you, Christian I, King of Denmark, who incidentally was brother-in-law of Barbara of Brandenburg, didn't visit until 1474. And we know this wall was finished in 1470. So it's an imagined meeting of him, Ludovico, meeting important people, a king and the Holy Roman Emperor. Above the doorway, there's some putti holding a stone slab, which Mantegna has dedicated the work, which he calls this slight work, to dedicating it to Ludovico and Barbara, dated 1474. And despite his proclaimed modesty, he was no doubt counting on the fact that the word he used to mean slight could also mean subtle or fine. And this is the view if you look up at the ceiling. He's playfully painted an oculus that illusionistically opens onto a blue sky, foreshortened putti frolicking around the balustrade. And this is one of the earliest, what we call di sotto in su, ceiling paintings. It's a brilliant tour de force. It engages the viewer. He's painted a potted plant balanced on a thin wooden support that looks ready to fall. There are people looking down at us, looking over the balustrade, and it's all painted to entertain the viewer with the then modern miracle of perspective. I had to show you this because it's one of the great masterpieces of the Italian Renaissance, and it's also within half a mile of where I live. It's enormous. It now occupies a long gallery at Hampton Court Palace, which is to the west of London. Oh, incidentally, if you are thinking of visiting, please check first, as currently, as I've recalled this, 6 of the 9 paintings are in the National Gallery because the gallery at Hampton Court is being refurbished. But in total, when I last saw it at Hampton Court, it consists of 9 canvases, each about 2.8 meters. That's about 9 feet long. So the complete work, which has a pediment between each painting, is about 90 feet long. The length of the gallery, it fills the gallery, or 27 meters. It's known as the Triumphs of Caesar, and it illustrates one long procession culminating on the right. I'll show you a close-up in a moment, with the arrival of Julius Caesar, and it was commissioned by Francesco Gonzaga. And the reason it ended up in Hampton Court is it was the Gonzaga family became bankrupt, and it was acquired by Charles I of Britain in 1629, and it's remained at Hampton Court Palace ever since. In case you're wondering, after Charles I was executed, there was what's called a Commonwealth sale of all of his artworks, but Cromwell, who was living at Hampton Court, said that this work, one of the greatest works of art in the UK, should not be sold, and that's why it remains there. The first scene shows the trumpeters leading the procession. Incidentally, it's painted in tempera, not oils, and the colours have faded over time. This series of paintings here is slightly brighter and clearer to see than the actual tempera paintings on the wall at Hampton Court. Note the level of detail and the accuracy of the representation of ancient Rome, which he studied ancient texts in great detail. The second painting of the series is the statue bearers, showing some of the spoils of war, which is what the whole procession is about, all of the spoils of war that have been captured by Julius Caesar and being taken back to Rome. The banner, incidentally, describes Julius Caesar's triumph and victory over the Gauls, although this procession doesn't represent a particular victory parade, but it's a sort of combination of descriptions of various parades and triumphs of Caesar by various Roman writers. These are the trophy bearers, and they are carrying various parts of suits of armour taken from the enemy. The vase bearers show more spoils of war associated with the name of Julius Caesar. The whole procession is to celebrate the Julius Caesar himself and his victories, and you can see his name on the banners tied to the trumpets. So it was a noisy procession full of movement and sound and the goods and spoils of war. Here we see the exotic animals that are captured, elephants captured from the enemy. Incidentally, Gonzaga, who commissioned this work, was himself a successful soldier who no doubt commissioned his work to associate himself with one of the great soldiers of ancient Rome. And I'll be talking later about the association people felt during the Renaissance the rebirth. It was the rebirth of the wonders and victories and empire of the ancient world. These are the corselet bearers. A corselet is a piece of armor that covers the chest. And you can see it being carried here with various vases and other goods. But this is captured slaves, men, women, and children of all ages destined to be sold at the slave market. There would have been thousands. They would enter Roman households. They were treated as commodities. They could be bought and sold. And the other destiny of the slaves, many were sent to the mines where conditions were so hard, the average survival was only a few years. Rome had extensive mining operations and it consumed thousands of slaves. Being sent there was essentially a death sentence. The musicians add to the noise of the procession. And as I said, it was to announce and celebrate the victories of Caesar, who we finally see here at the end, the last person to arrive, seated Caesar on a chariot holding the victor's palm. And in the background is a triumphal arch. These were built and can be seen in the Roman Forum still today as a lasting reminder of Roman victories. So this whole series of large paintings in the Renaissance period, in the later Italian Renaissance, they were extremely influential. The famous biographer Giorgio Vasari, in his celebrated Lives of the Artists, described this as Mantegna's best work, and it was extremely influential on later artists. Another work by Mantegna is this daringly original view of Christ, shown as a corpse without the heroism and nobleness normally associated with representations of Christ. It's simply a dead body on a mortuary slab, a pair of feet thrust towards us, trapped in this small tomb-like space with three mourners on the left pressing into the corner of the picture. We believe it was painted between around about in the 1490s, maybe up to 1501 has been suggested. And he kept it in his studio and never sold it, assume it wasn't commissioned. And it was used at the head of his coffin when he died. This is this shows Madonna and Child with St. John the Baptist and Mary Magdalene, and I'll be talking about how the scholars of the period equated their love of pagan antiquity with Christianity, because of course the gods and goddesses of the ancient world were pagan. They weren't considered an alternative to religion. They were regarded as an extra rich source of exciting sexual and illuminating myths. Of course, knowledge of antiquity was the province of the wealthy. And so it was a demonstration of, to demonstrate your knowledge was a demonstration of your wealth and learning. And to some extent, therefore, it became a fashion of the rich. But also, of course, they were learning new ideas in philosophy and practical knowledge when they were rediscovering the texts from ancient Rome and rediscovering the power and beauty of ancient Rome. So it was an artistic and intellectual underpinning of the work that was being done in the Renaissance period. Incidentally, the other thing about this work, I should mention, Mantegna brings a new treatment to the figure of baby Jesus, the Christ child. It's very difficult for artists to combine the natural form of a baby with the attributes of God. And the way he's done it in this case is that the Christ is standing, raising his hand in benediction, a sort of an adult gesture and an expression that conveys maturity, together with the body of a child. Incidentally, the subtle twist in the that's one of the, we can see his name written on the top of this here. It's written just here. And what I wanted to do is to compare a close-up of the stance with the Apollo Belvedere, which was unearthed in 1490. And the important thing, it was regarded as a very important discovery work from the ancient classical period. And it's the stance I wanted to draw your attention to. The weight is placed on one leg and the other leg is raised slightly, normally with the toe just touching the ground and the hips and upper body twisted away from the weight-bearing leg. We now know the pose, we call it the contrapposto pose, meaning from the Italian counterpoise or place against. And it gives the figure a much more dynamic appearance, but also relaxed. It's a sort of casual, but still dynamic. And Mantegna, he's using this, has learnt this from the statue that had been recently unearthed, and he's used it to add that dynamism to the figures we see in the painting. So this is an example of a secular work that is drawing inspiration from works of the classical period. It's called Parnassus, and it was the first picture painted by Mantegna for Isabella d'Este for a room she created called a studiolo in the ducal palace in Mantua. And the theme of the paintings in this room, I think it ended up with 5 paintings. The theme was the victory of virtues over vices, a theme suggested by the court poet at the time. And we believe there was an interpretation of this painting written by a late 15th century poet, which identified it as Mount Parnassus, thus the name. And what we see are 2 gods. Let me show you a close-up. On an arch of rock in front of a symbolic bed. That's the red, white, or the blue, white, and red behind them. They are accompanied by a figure of Anteros representing love, and they're thought to be representations of Isabella, shown as Venus, and Francesco Gonzaga as Mars. And you can see Anteros, let me point here, with a blowpipe pointing at the genitals of the person in the cave, who is Venus's husband, Vulcan. So he's being, what's the right word, disabled to allow Venus and Mars to unify. In the clearing under the arch, there's Apollo playing a lyre on the left, 9 muses dancing, and it's an allegory of universal harmony. And according to ancient mythology, the dancing and the chanting could generate earthquakes and other catastrophes. It's symbolized by the sort of crumbling mountain on the upper left. Such disasters could also result from the Pegasus's horse on the right, and it appears to be tapping its hoof, which could generate a spring of water, which we see on the right, or an earthquake. Next to the horse Pegasus is Mercury, the winged messenger god. You can see the wings on his ankles. Coming back to the commission, Isabella d'Este assigned or entrusted Mantegna with the first 2 canvases of the cycle. This is the first, the second Minerva, but she considered his work was a little out of date, and she turned to other painters. She tried to get Giovanni Bellini, but he didn't leave Venice. She tried to get Leonardo da Vinci. She tried to get Francesco Francia, but disappointed, in 1505, she appointed Perugino, but wasn't happy with what he produced. And so she appointed Lorenzo Costa, the court painter, after Mantegna's death, and he completed the decoration with 2 more canvases to decorate this studiolo, this room she was creating in the palace. This is the introduction of the cult, the Cybele, at Rome, and it's in the National Gallery in London. Now, in 2004 BCE, the Romans brought the cult of Cybele from the east, from Asia Minor to Rome. And what Mantegna's done here is he's combined the accounts that are written of this by Ovid, Livy, and Appian. And at first glance, when you see this work in the National Gallery, you can easily overlook it because of its dull colours, the grey colours. However, it's quite an important work because of the poses, which is what I wanted to focus on, starting with, before I look at the painting, I just wanted to show you this painting, which I think is related. Pogliuolo, this was painted by the brothers Antonio and Piero Pogliuolo, and it's the martyrdom of Saint Sebastian. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is the 3 pairs of poses, the pair behind, which are related to views of essentially the same person, and the pair on the outer side and on the inner side. You see the 2 inside, we're looking essentially the same person from the front and from the back. So this is, in other words, a study in poses, and to some extent I think that detracts from the painting itself, because it places too much attention on the clever posing of the figures. He's even got a horse, 2 horses, one shown from behind and one from the front, on both sides of the picture. But I mention that earlier painting to show you the influence. Now, returning to the Mantegna, on the left-hand side, we see we see the procession coming in, and the figures on the left carrying the laurel branch. Notice his left leg and right arm, left leg forward and right arm forward, whereas the Asian eunuch at the head of the litter has his right leg forward and left arm forward. So again, what I'm showing you is sort of two versions of a way of representing the body, but in this case, very natural. Unless, if I hadn't drawn your attention to it, you might not even have noticed it. It's incorporated in the figure, in the painting, in a way that doesn't draw attention to itself. The next figure on the right mirrors the pose of the laurel bearer in terms of the way the legs are moved, but the head's turned back in this case. And the pose links to the excited figure on the point of kneeling down, welcoming the bust of Cybele. Now, on the right-hand side, the organizer of this procession is the figure clasping his toga at the shoulder on the left, and that shows he's an orator. Then there are three standing figures towards the front. Maybe I should point to them. This one, and this one, in three, almost as if the person is turning three different views of the body, which introduces a dynamism into the picture, but doesn't detract from the picture itself. It makes the picture more alive. It brings it to life with this showing the figures in different poses. And it supports the subject matter of the painting, which was probably commissioned by Cornaro, one of the wealthy families, which and they wanted to link their name back to the famous Roman family Cornelli, a similar name. And the Cornellis in ancient Rome played a role in the transportation of the Cybele from ancient Crete to the temple in Rome. And this is the complete work now, as I said, in the National Gallery in London. Now I'm switching to Bellini. This, incidentally, is an early work by Bellini, and it does actually have some of the hard linear quality of Mantegna. That maybe he was quite happy to learn from other artists. Maybe he was following the example of his brother-in-law, Andrea Mantegna, but it could have been the sculpture of Donatello, which we know Bellini studied in Padua. The other reason it's a little bit harsher than it would originally have been is that it's been cleaned with a strong abrasive, and that has destroyed the surface of the painting and added to that feeling of hardness. This is a representation of St. Francis of Assisi, and he's receiving or about to receive the stigmata, which are the wounds of Christ on his hands, feet and side. He's believed to have received them in 1224 during a retreat to Mount Alverna in the Apennines. The other aspect of this painting is the link to Moses. Moses was seen by the Franciscans as their spiritual ancestor, and the water trickling from the spout on the left reflects the miraculous fountain Moses brought forth from the rocks on Mount Horeb. And the empty sandals, we believe, under the desk recall God's command to Moses, "Put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." If you look towards the back, the landscape. You see there's a heron, that's a symbol of solitude and contemplation. And St. Francis, of course, is known for his love of animals and nature. And the donkey symbolises humility and patience, which were also two virtues associated with St. Francis. Now, Bellini has combined this view of nature with this religious painting of St. Francis in ecstasy with a generic, it's not a particular Italian town, a generic Italian hill town in the background. And he's given it this radiant glow that infuses the painting with this magical feeling. A special event is taking place in the midst of the ordinary, an ordinary landscape, an ordinary donkey, a town in the background. A very different painting by Bellini is this allegorical painting, which is very difficult to interpret it. There have been many interpretations. Some just see it as a vision of paradise, but there's been much more specific interpretations representing the journey's soul of purification described in poems at the time. There's a 14th century French poem called The Pilgrimage of the Soul that this might be based on. If you look at the other side of the lake, I'll point to it here, there's a hermit shepherd who could be Saint Anthony on a spiritual path inspired by the first hermit, Saint Paul. And he's obviously got to overcome several obstacles because here, hidden away by these stairs, there's a centaur. The terrace in the foreground represents paradise. The souls in purgatory are maybe symbolized by the children waiting to be admitted to heaven. Mary's on the left, sitting. She's the advocate of men before God, and she's sitting with the crowned figure of justice. There's two saints standing on the right. There's Job and obviously Saint Sebastian. They might represent the patrons who commissioned the work. There's two behind the parapet. One is St. Paul, the one with the sword, and the other is possibly St. Peter guarding the entrance to paradise. We don't know what the children are doing, but you can see they're playing with silver fruit, possibly from that tree as the tree of knowledge, but the tree of knowledge normally has a serpent in it, so it could be the tree of life, and then it would be symbolizing eternal life and divine wisdom. It's a significant painting in the development of Venetian art, as it represents this shift towards this symbolic, the poetic, dreamlike style, which is followed by works by Giorgione and others. Portrait of a young man, we're not sure who it is. It's Bellini's last surviving portrait and the only one with a landscape background. And he's following the example of Netherlandish portraits. It's a oil painting, so he's abandoned egg tempera in favour of oils. He's developed a broader, simplified style, losing the need to specify detail. He's painted the sitter and the landscape in a unified way, but they're both lit by the same soft golden light. The outlines are blurred. There's very little underdrawing, we know from infrared reflectography, and it's typical of Bellini's late technique. It's very subtle, and he's painted so that the face is insubstantial intentionally. The shadow where the lips press together is just a single painted line, for example. This is one of a small number of secular paintings by Bellini. again painted towards the end of his life. It's a complicated composition. It's a scene from Ovid. 17 figures feasted in a forest, and it was commissioned by the Duke of Ferrara for his study. And it contains many examples of sexuality. For example, many of the goddesses and nymphs have their breast exposed. The man in green on the right is Priapus. One of his roles is protector of male genitals, and he's typically depicted with an oversized permanent erection in ancient Roman art. Here he's pulling up the skirt of the sleeping nymph Lotis, and there's a story from ancient texts of Priapus trying to rape her when she was asleep, but she was awakened by the cry of a donkey and ran off, leaving him embarrassed as everyone else suddenly became aware of what was going on in his attentions. So that's one little story represented on the right there. The man in the center with his hand between the thighs of the woman, we think is meant to be a representation of the Duke and his wife. Now, the Duke asked a later painter, Dosso Dossi, to make a few changes to the painting after Bellini died. And in 1529, Titian made changes to the landscape, but left the figures unaltered. So we think the figures were definitely all painted by Giovanni Bellini. This is one of Bellini's most famous works. It's in the National Gallery in London, portrait of Doge Leonardo Loredan. He was Doge of Venice from 1501 to 1521, and he's wearing his formal robes of state for this portrait. It was quite normal for doges to have their portrait painted in this formal way, dressed in the robes of state. It's painted in the style of sculpted portrait busts, which were popular at the time, inspired by the Roman sculpture that was being discovered, being dug up. And Bellini signed his name, you can see down the bottom, in its Latin form on a small cartellino, a small piece of paper on the parapet. Bellini was famous for his portraiture, and he helped make this art form particularly popular in Venice. The painting, the reason it's in the National Gallery is that it was obviously originally in Venice, but it was looted by Napoleon, taken back to Paris, but for some reason they sold it to a British person, Thomas Beckford, when he was in Paris, and they sold it for 13 guineas in 1807, and then his family later sold it to the National Gallery for £630 in 1844, a very reasonable price. And this is the final work I wanted to show you by Bellini, Madonna of the Meadows. In fact, it's one of the few works I remember being shown by my art teacher at school. He would show us famous works of art every week, and this is one of the few, sadly, one of the few that I remember after all those years. A Madonna of the Meadows shows Jesus sleeping in the Virgin's lap. It's a natural pose, yet the way he's painted it anticipates the Pietà, where after his crucifixion, the dead body of Christ is laid across his mother's lap. It shows the two in normal farmland, fortified hill town. To the left of the Virgin, there's a wading bird, possibly a crane, attacking a snake, maybe intended to symbolize the struggle of good and evil. And then in the tree, remember the earlier picture I showed you with the vulture in the tree, symbolic of death. A divine light fills the painting. There's an emphasis on the detail of the natural landscape in the background. And this, I think, reflects the teachings of the Franciscans, who taught that all of nature is sacred. And although they are incorporated in the natural world and in the background, they are, as you can see, they're separated from it. They're not, she's not sitting obviously on the ground in the painting. She's part of it, but separated from it. So Giovanni Bellini and Andrea Mantegna were, as I said, born a year apart. They had very different backgrounds. However, the genius of Mantegna, even though he was from a poor background, led to Jacopo Bellini marrying his daughter to Mantegna. And so the two artists became related by marriage, but although they influenced each other, they continued to work in different styles, as I've shown you. Bellini was the restrained person who produced emotional works. Mantegna was the emotional person who produced restrained works. And Bellini ran a large workshop in Venice. Giorgione and Titian were his apprentices. Titian, of course, went on to become the leading artist in Venice, eclipsing Bellini's fame. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to researching the next talk and giving you the next talk soon. Goodbye for now.